and welcome to the debate with the candidates for the North Dakota Legislative District 47 Senate seat, Mike Dwyer and Brandy Jude. I'm Robin Thorstensen, member of the League of Women Voters, and I'll be the moderator. This debate has been organized by the League of Women Voters and takes place in the studios of Dakota Media Access. The debate format is as follows. Each candidate will have 60 seconds to make an opening statement. After opening statements, the candidates will respond to questions. Each candidate will have 90 seconds to respond to each question. After each candidate has responded to the question, we invite them to engage in a debate through open dialogue about the issue raised, for no more than 3 minutes. After the final question, each candidate will then have 60 seconds to make a closing statement. This is intended to be a respectful exchange of ideas and to provide the citizens of North Dakota an opportunity to get to know the candidates better. The candidates have not received questions in advance, and the first responses to questions will be rotated between the candidates. Candidates are asked to comply with our time restrictions so that we can get to as many questions as possible. Our timer will let you know when your question responses are down to 30 seconds, 10 seconds, and stop. For the open debate segment, our timer will indicate when we are down to 1 minute and stop. So, let's get to our candidates. You each have 60 seconds to make your opening statement. Mike, you may begin.
Hi, I am Mike Dwyer, Republican candidate for District 47 State Senate. My priorities are private business and jobs, education, family, and Bismarck. I have an entrepreneurial spirit. When we were just starting out, we sold fireworks, delivered newspapers, and mowed lawns. I started Clearwater Communications with Dana Bond in Bismarck and a title company with my son Jack. Together with Dwyer Law Office, we have over 30 employees, so I understand issues like salaries and health insurance. I will also be a strong advocate for education. 3 of my children are teachers and 2 of my daughters-in-law are teachers, and my wife is a school counselor. So quality education is very important for our family and also very important for District 47. Patty and I love Bismarck, a wonderful city, and I will work to keep it safe and support our community in every way I can. I also will support and defend family values, programs for behavioral health and life. Thank you.
Thank you. Brandy.
Thank you, Robin. And thank you to the League of Women Voters and to everyone tuning in to our online broadcast. I'm running to become the next senator of District 47 because for the first time in 24 years, we have a vacant seat and a perfect opportunity to bring in a fresh perspective to revitalize the North Dakota legislation. I'm a mother, a veteran, and a founder of a local nonprofit, and through my own experience and by listening to community members, I have a firm understanding of family issues, whether it's creating economic opportunity or maintaining our safe neighborhoods. I have the background and leadership skills to look at issues at all angles, create respectful partnerships, and to address challenges with dignity. Throughout this forum, I hope to highlight traits and values that make me the best senator for District 47. Thank you.
Thank you. So let's jump right into our first question. And Brandy, you'll have the first response. So, in your opinion, what is the number one issue to be addressed by the legislature in the coming session?
One of the number one issues that I see that we need to address in our legislation is to actually involve young professionals so that we can look at budget issues, infrastructure needs, and behavioral health from different angles and perspectives. When we have very little balance in our legislation, that leaves very limited discussion for opposition, and I think it's really healthy to actually have discussions with opposition as long as they're respectful and held with integrity. And this way we're able to look at these issues and address it for the range of residents in District 47.
Thank you. Mike, same question. What is the number one issue, in your opinion, to be addressed by the legislature this session?
Well, I think it's impossible to break it down into a number one issue because education is so vitally important, but then that goes into the issues of budget and funding for education. I believe that we need to address education in a vigorous manner and provide new programs, innovative programs. My daughter's a school counselor, and CTE, career and technical education, for example, is very important because it provides opportunities for students to learn skills, because there's so many opportunities for skilled workers, and it provides opportunities for those students to learn those skills. But that goes into funding. Budget is a critical issue because you can't talk about any issue without talking about budget and making sure that there is funding for those issues. So budget is certainly an issue that affects every one of the issues that we address.
Great, thank you. So let's have a little bit more dialogue about these priorities. And so do either of you have a response to the other's initial thoughts?
Well, I think the legislature's done a really nice job. This last session, they didn't cut education. They did have to make reductions of about $1.7 billion in our state funding because of the downturn in revenues. I've worked in the legislative process, and I've had great relationships with both Republicans and Democrats. And so in the legislature, they seem to, or my experience is that they work well together. And the minority certainly has been able to express opinions, and the outcomes have, in my opinion, been fairly successful.
What are your thoughts?
Some of my thoughts that I have are to kind of highlight a statement that my opponent just made, is that the minority may have been able to make opinions, but it doesn't mean that ideas are being integrated fairly. And I think that our legislation does lack balance, and when you are having that lack of balance, you are not having new ideas brought to the table or implemented. And when we look at schools, I don't disagree with the idea of innovation, but I do have concern about how that would be implemented, as well as making sure that we're maintaining the fundamental skills that are necessary for students to be competitive in our economy moving forward. And additionally to that, I think that there have been things passed that the state government has made statements about, saying that they're going to cover 80% of school costs. However, with the changes over the course of 2 to 4 years, school demands don't remain the same, and those do fall on the responsibilities of the residents in the districts to cover those costs.
Anything further we would like to kind of explore about this particular priority of education?
No.
Okay, all right. Well, let's shift gears then and go to a different question, still somewhat related to education, which is, let's talk about higher ed, and specifically the governance of the North Dakota university system. So Mike, what is your assessment of the governance of the North Dakota university system?
Well, as we all know, Governor Burgum has convened a task force to address that issue, and good for him for doing so. There's been a lot of turmoil in the higher education. There's been a turnover of chancellors. There's been conflicts between universities and the State Board of Higher Education. I know one of the things that they're talking about is possibly having different boards, and I'm not sure that I would agree with that idea, because I think it would just create more turf building and more fiefdoms of higher education. But perhaps the board should be appointed by the governor and at his will, and those appointees should be terminated at his will, so that they do work closely with the governor. I'm not sure what the answers are. The task force certainly will come up with some recommendations. Maybe it should be like the Public Service Commission, where there's 3 or 5 higher education commissioners who are full-time, and that's what they deal with, because we have 11 universities, and it's a huge amount of funding, a huge enormous issues. So can't really say what should be done, but certainly it's good that it's being addressed.
Brandy, same question. What is your assessment of the governance of the North Dakota university system?
From what I've seen, I feel that there needs to be further discussion on what direction we really want to be going with the university system as a state. I've heard discussions about it being, a competitive market, spoken about almost like a product, but I think until we're able to have a little more discussion, not just with the government and the leaders in those universities, but as well as the students who are going through those schools and really getting an idea of what they're seeking and how they're seeking opportunities through them, then we can start having better ideas to move forward with.
Any additional thoughts about this discussion in terms of the two boards involving students?
Sounds like we're kind of in agreement on, it's good that we're addressing it.
Yes.
And clearly there's been issues that need to be addressed. What the right answers for, the governor's task force, are spending a lot of time, and so hopefully they'll come up with some answers that can be bipartisan and provide good solutions for our higher education.
Great.
I agree. I don't think education should be looked at as a partisan issue.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing. Let's shift gears. And this came up in one of our first responses, and it's the topic of behavioral health services. And so what would be your priorities for improving access to behavioral health services? And Brandy, you'll be able to lead off with this.
Okay. With behavioral health, one of the things that I'd like to see the state do is actually implement some of the recommendations from the Schultz and HRSI studies that have been done. We had allocated the funding for that research, and I think at this point we need to start implementing those comprehensive services so that we can continue moving forward as a state to address it. We have a lot of great organizations and entities that are working collaboratively with the local and state government to serve those individuals who are in need of that comprehensive support, whether it be addiction or homelessness. But at the end of the day, if we're not continuing to look at how it's impacting those individuals as well as our economy and how we're spending that state and federal funding, we're really not getting to the root of the problem.
So Mike, what would be your priorities for improving access?
Well, clearly there's a problem. There was 60,000 overdose deaths in the United States last year. North Dakota is sixth, I believe, in drug and alcohol abuse. The suicide rate is climbing, and it's too high. 50% of our arrests are drug or alcohol related, and so there clearly needs to be a focus and resources directed towards behavioral health. Our First Lady is spending a lot of time with her Recovery Reinvented program, which is a great thing because it concentrates not just on treatment, but on pre-treatment activities, prevention, which is very important because we have a tendency to spend our resources on treatment once kids or adults are in trouble, but we need more resources on pre-treatment, prevention, and then after treatment for recovery. And so the state of North Dakota took over county social services this past legislative session, and I know the Department of Human Services is trying to do some of what Brandy talked about, which is to make the programs efficient and coordinated. But we clearly need to apply resources to behavioral health and do a good job of taking care of our people.
Okay. So you both agree that more needs to happen and more resources. Mm-hmm. So how do you all propose that might take place? What should the legislature's role be in getting those resources out there to address behavioral health? And we'll just open that up for dialogue here.
Do we take turns or just jump in?
You jump in. We're not just jump right.
Well, okay. So the legislature took over county social services, and so the funding of them, and that was the first time that happened in 2017. So now both the state and local county social service agencies are trying to figure out, okay, who's going to do what? How are we going to provide these services? How are we going to avoid duplication? How are we going to make sure that we're being adequate in terms of what we do, and then how do we make sure that we're directing our resources at the right on the right focus, so that it's not just treatment, but prevention and then recovery, so that people have a chance. There's clearly our addiction rate is too high, and so we want to do the best job we can.
To bring it back down to a little more of like family focus, if we're not looking at how this is addiction and behavioral health is impacting the students and providing them adequate services, either through our public schools, as well as working with the families for prevention, treatment, and recovery, we're really not going to move forward very much. And when we're not having honest conversations about how it's actually impacting the next generation that's going home to the parent or the relative that they're being raised by that's struggling with this addiction, they're going to be led into a similar cycle if they're not properly prepared on how to take a different path. And with recovery, a lot of times we talk about that, but one of the main things that I see that's always missing out of it is actually the family part being included into it. So we put the person through treatment, and then the support system is still left out on how they can be an adequate support system to that individual who's coming out of, a situation of addiction or homelessness, whatever it may be. And I think that some of those conversations need to be taking place, and we need to be honest and genuine about it.
Great.
Randy, are you saying that there needs to be more emphasis in schools, or are you just talking about?
I think it needs to be more encompassed, as when we're looking at wraparound services, that we're really looking at each part of it. I mean, when a child is influenced by a parent or a relative that struggles with addiction, and we put them through treatment, and then they're coming out of that, and part of recovery is having a strong support system, and that includes the children involved with that addict who's going through that transition of their life. We need to have conversations about how we can continue educating the support systems just as much as we're educating the addict or the person struggling with behavioral health.
My wife's a school counselor, so this is a subject that's dear to my heart because while she can't, for confidentiality reasons, can't tell me names, she's told me a lot of stories. And one of the discussions has been, should there be more school counselors in schools? And I think there should be, because there's such a shortage.
Okay, so that leads us right into a slightly different topic, yet related. So let's talk about what should the legislature's role be in ensuring a quality and sustainable K-12 program throughout the state. And so we'll start with you, and then we'll pick right back up where you left off. So Brandy, what do you think the legislature's role should be in providing a quality and sustainable K-12 program throughout the state?
I think part of the state government should be upholding the promises that they've made in the past about, adequately funding the school systems, and then also looking at the adjustments. If we're looking at needing more counselors, which I actually do agree with Mike on this, is that we do need more of those services and support, especially as our public schools become more crowded, that we're looking at how that's going to adjust the cost and impact the local residents and the local governance taking over the cost and impact of that. But when we talk about equality in our school systems, again, I think we need to sit down with the residents and start having discussions and conversations with them and hear what they feel is not being represented in our school systems or represented on us from our state government.
Okay, thank you. Mike.
Well, clearly the local school district's role is to provide the education, and they need to be the ones in charge. As far as the state's role, clearly the most important piece is funding, and the state, I think maybe 13 or 15, completely revamped the funding approach to K-12 education, and now school districts can levy up to 60 or 70 mills, and some of them do less because the valuation is higher, and so they provide more revenue, but then the state provides the rest. And we have a couple issues. We have more students. I think we had like almost 9,000 new students in this last school year, and so the state has to be in a position to provide that additional funding. And then some of the other programs that we've talked about, school counseling, CTE, just making sure that those programs are part of our school systems.
Great. So what additional thoughts would you all like to add to this topic?
One of the questions that I always have when we're thinking about the state's role with schools or behavioral health is when we're talking about funding and we're looking at how there may be ongoing budget cuts, how are the state departments also collaborating? We have to start looking at things from different angles. We really do. I think having fundamental structures to continue moving our government forward is really important, but we also need to look at some of the old principles that are keeping us from evolving as a community and as a state. And when we're looking at some of these issues, I think we need to bring in new voices and have some fresh perspective on how we can address these things differently.
Mike?
So when you say old principles, are you talking about the people, the principals, or the superintendent types, or are you talking about, policy principles?
I'm talking about policy principles.
Okay. Yeah. Well, clearly in our district, in District 47, education is critical. We have so many young families. Brandy's gone door to door. I've gone door to door. I mean, there's kids everywhere. I went to one cul-de-sac, and the lady told me that just a few years ago, they were all retired in their cul-de-sac, and now there's 16 kids. And so, people have moved on, and young families have moved in. So it's such a critical issue, and how the Department of Public Instruction provides oversight and guidance to our local school districts. The school governance has to be local. It has to be provided by the local school board. My son-in-law is on the school board, so he gets excited about telling about all the things that they deal with. But anyway, it's very important.
Wonderful. So let's talk about something a little bit different. Let's talk a little bit about property taxes. And we'll start off actually with a question around the farm home exemption. The North Dakota Association of Counties has voted to support a resolution to eliminate the farm home exemption. So what is your position on the farm home exemption, and how do you feel about that disparity between ag property taxation and residential taxation? And we'll start with you, Mike.
Well, the farm home exemption is if you are a farm and a majority of your income comes from the farm, then you qualify and you don't pay property taxes on your farmstead. So I would oppose eliminating that because, North Dakota, energy is an important part of our economy, tourism is an important part of our economy, but agriculture is still the backbone of North Dakota. We're a rural state. We have some wonderful communities like Bismarck and Minot, Fargo, Grand Forks, Williston, Dickinson, Jamestown, Devils Lake, but still, Class B, and it's a rural state, and I just think that we should continue to provide that benefit, support for our family farmers.
Okay, great, thank you. Brandy, so what is your position on the farm home exemption, and what do you think of the disparity between ag property taxation and residential property taxation?
I actually agree with my opponent pretty much to the T on that. I really do agree with supporting our local farmers, and I think if that's something that we can continue doing for them, I actually support that.
Okay.
I wasn't aware that the Associated Counties were proposing that, but if I'm elected and if Brandy's elected, I would oppose it.
I would as well.
Okay. Well, thank you for sharing on that particular point. So let's stick with the topic of ag a little bit, and let's talk about the growing number of corporate farms and the fact that corporate farming is a growing topic here in North Dakota. Brandy, should corporate farming have a place in North Dakota agriculture, and how should the legislature respond to the growth in corporate farming?
Being that this is something that I would like to further have conversations with experts in that industry, I didn't grow up on a farm, I grew up in Bismarck. And so my understanding from it is through research and resources that I reach out to. And so before coming to a final conclusion on that decision, of course I would want to have further discussion. But again, when it comes down to it, I strongly support local farmers and local families. And so if there are things that are going to impede on their ability to continue being family farmers in North Dakota, I would take a very hard look at what we're going to be implementing with corporate farms.
Okay. Mike, same question.
Farmers Union sent out a survey to all candidates, and I responded to that survey saying that I support North Dakota's corporate farm law, which I do. It's been a volatile subject for the last few years. The legislature passed a provision allowing corporate farms for dairy and hogs. The people overturned that provision. Farm Bureau then filed a lawsuit against our corporate farm law, but the district court just recently upheld North Dakota's corporate farm law. Hopefully, North Dakota Farmers Union and Farm Bureau could get together, and I do think there needs to be some adjustments, because for those of us that are involved in family farms, we want to be able to create mechanisms to pass those farms on to the next generation. And the current provision that allows LLCs and family corporations, it's a little too tight, because it has to be the very immediate family. And I have 3 children that are involved in our farm operation, and so we want to make sure that the mechanism allows our farm to be passed on.
Okay, great. Any further thoughts on this topic? All right, let's shift gears yet again. Voting centers, centralized locations where citizens could cast their votes regardless of their address, has been proposed in the past for Burleigh County. What is your position on implementing voting centers for future elections, or even implementing further voter identification requirements? And I believe we start with you, Mike.
Okay, so could you clarify that question a little bit? Because
voting centers have been proposed in the past for Burleigh County, which would be centralized locations, fewer number of locations, where people would go to cast their vote regardless of what their address is within the community. What's your position on the idea of voting centers? And do you have any thoughts about adding voter identification requirements?
Well, on the voting centers, I think Burleigh County was actually talking about, were they not? And then some folks attended a hearing of the commission and convinced or maybe for whatever reason they decided to have more voting centers. It's kind of nice to be able to go to a local facility, a church or a school, or up in our area we vote at Century Baptist. But I think there was more than one voting place in our district, and I like that. But I don't know that it would diminish the number of voters if you had voting centers either. So I don't particularly have a strong feeling on that issue. On the issue of voter identification, which the U.S. Supreme Court just ruled on this week, I think it's good that there be some form of identification like they're trying to establish, so that you don't have voter fraud.
Okay, all right. Brandy, your thoughts, your response to that question?
With the ID or voter identification, I agree with some of the remarks Mike has made. I think that to minimize voter fraud, we should have some type of voter ID or identification. With the voting centers, one of the concerns that I have are for the populations that aren't able to easily get around, transportation needs. What are those centers' hours going to look like? How are they going to impact people who work shift work or who aren't able to have their own vehicles but rely heavily on public transportation? How that's going to impact people's ability and their motivation to go out and vote. When you start minimizing or reducing opportunities or the convenience of voting, people become inactive, and then we have less response. And that is one of the concerns that I have, is people feeling that they don't have the ability to go out and vote because their location would be out of their way, or they would have an inability to get there.
Listening to Brandy on the voting centers, that makes sense. The more the better. And the more local the better. Just because, it's such an American tradition to be able to vote.
Yeah.
And so to go to a place that you're familiar with, where there's parking, is a good idea.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, I can honestly say the League of Women Voters always loves it when people talk about access to voting. So that's great. Thank you. So let's talk about the Legacy Fund. Brandy, you'll have first response. How do you propose the legislature should use earnings from the Legacy Fund?
With the Legacy Fund, I have heard different conversations revolving around it. There was a suggestion brought up by one of the Republican representatives out of Minot that brought up the idea of potentially having bonds or, lending for infrastructure projects or needs, and I think that's something that we should be revisiting. You wouldn't go into a bank and they would have the expectation at the bank that you would pay for your house in cash and full. And some of the conversations that I'm concerned about when we go back and forth about the Legacy Fund is that that's the expectations of some of these counties and communities to be able to do to meet some of their infrastructure needs. But then on the flip side, we're also using some of that interest to start paying off some of our daily operations. So I think we need to revisit some of the ideas that have been brought up and go from there.
Mike, how do
Excuse me.
you propose that we should use earnings from the Legacy Fund?
Okay, so when you asked the question, what's the single most important issue? High on the list, which we didn't discuss, is infrastructure. We have tremendous infrastructure needs in our state. Our roads, our highways, our bridges, our streets, water projects, flood control, water supply, and there's two proposals to address our infrastructure needs. But as far as the Legacy Fund is one of the best things that North Dakota has done to provide a long-term fund for the oil development that's occurring now, because it won't be there forever. So it's just a tremendous thing. There's about $6 billion in the fund, and Senator Hogue from Minot has proposed that we start using about 15% of the earnings or the income from the fund and use that for infrastructure loans. I think it's a great idea. If you look at the portfolio of the investments of the $6 billion, some of it's in cash, earning about a 0.01% interest. Some of it's in diversified real assets, earning about 1.03%. That's as of April. And so the proposal that Senator Hogue has put forth would allocate some of the funds of the Legacy Fund for 1.56 interest loans for infrastructure. I think it's a great idea.
Okay. So let's talk about this a little bit more. Clearly there's a slightly difference of opinion about what we should do with the Legacy Fund. What other thoughts do you have in terms of how should the fund be used? Well,
I don't think it should be used for operations. I think you were making that point. I think but I think the, if you look at the investment portfolio, I think the opportunity to save money for local taxpayers, because if local communities, they have to do these streets or these roads or these bridges, they have to do them. And so if there is a means to provide a loan that's cheaper than what a bond issue would be for that local community, then that saves taxpayers money. So it just makes sense. It benefits from the local level all the way up.
Brandy?
And I don't know if I have too much of a different opinion on that. I think that we should be revisiting some of these ideas to be lending or bonding out some of the funds from the Legacy Fund to support the infrastructure needs that communities and counties are needing.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. Our rural communities have expressed that they have concerns about maintaining their EMT and ambulance systems. So, Mike, do you have any ideas for how the legislature can support or boost rural EMT and ambulance systems?
Well, we've discussed, North Dakota being a rural state, and we do have, these rural areas. And thank you to all the volunteers that do fire, local fire, and ambulance. Measure 4 would provide free license plates and passes to the state parks. I certainly agree with the passes to the state parks. I think we need to provide, some benefits like that. I'm not sure that the license plate is going to be the right answer, because what if they're not in their car and they don't have their license plate? But I think some kind of a card to have free access to parks is great. And other incentives, maybe there can be some insurance for these local volunteers. Maybe there can be some compensation. I'm not sure. but it is something that needs to be addressed because our rural communities depend on both our local firefighters and our local EMT folks.
Okay, great, thank you. Brandy, how about you? What ideas do you have for the legislature to support and boost EMT and ambulance systems?
I agree that it is something that we do need to be looking at on the legislature level, being that I'm a candidate out of District 47 and it not being necessarily a rural district. My focus as a candidate is looking at how those services are needed in our area. And so once elected in, that would be a discussion I would have further, because then I'd be able to meet with the right people from those rural communities that you're talking about to really be able to understand the needs that they're expressing and what they're looking for, and how we can work together as a state government and support their rural needs.
Wonderful, thank you. So, any further thoughts, Mike?
Obviously, it needs to be addressed. Yeah. And Measure 4 is an effort to address that very question that you've asked, and whether that's the right thing or other things or a combination of other things. It's important.
Okay, great, thank you. So, next question is, in what way should the state budget impact property taxes? And we'll start with you, Brandy. How should the state budget impact property taxes?
I guess I'm wondering what you mean by that question.
Well, and the truth of the matter is I think a lot of citizens really feel like the legislature and some of their actions have influence on property taxes. Mm-hmm. And so, from your perspective, what should the legislature do or not do to influence property taxes in the coming year?
Thank you for your clarification.
Sure, not a problem.
Honestly, I do support any type of revenue and spending that's responsible, fair, and sustainable. But again, as you pointed out, there have been some imbalanced approaches, and I really think that we need to start having some sincere and real conversations about the significant tax breaks that we're giving to out-of-state companies. Like Mike said, we've been door knocking, and I've been door knocking since late April, early May, and I've met thousands of residents at the door. And not one of them has told me how this approach has benefited their families or their property taxes. And so when I think about whether or not we're increasing or decreasing any type of taxes on our residents, we need to have those conversations with those individuals.
Mike, same question. What do you think the legislature should or should not do that might influence or impact property taxes?
Well, I think the legislature has been doing a wonderful job providing property tax relief. The last, I think, 2 sessions, they had a 12% buy down. When the whole education funding formula was overturned, instead of 185 mills with the state paying a foundation aid payment, instead local districts are paying up to 60 mills or less if their valuation is higher, and the state covers the rest. And then there's other things that the legislature has done. This last session, they took over county social service funding, which which eliminated the need for local counties to assess mills to provide for those county social services. So not every county was levying up to the 20 mills that they were authorized for county social services, but now the state is providing that funding. So it was a property tax relief effort. And so the state has, and there's been other examples, the state took over the court system, and that was funded by property taxes in the past. So, and that was quite a while ago. So anyway, the state, every time in its budgeting decisions, the state affects and provides benefits to local property taxpayers.
Okay. Any further discussion about this?
I don't know, Brandy, I don't know if you were referring to corporate income tax when you were talking about conversations with your, in all of my visits with, knocking on doors with our constituents, I didn't have one single person bring up property taxes. And so I don't know if they feel like it's being addressed properly or their property taxes aren't too high, but it didn't seem to be an issue in all of my door knocking so far.
Brandy, I sense that you might have had a different experience.
Maybe we were knocking in different parts of our district, because in certain areas it absolutely was brought up and they discussed the increases that they were having. And that's where I'll leave it.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. Well, this brings us then to the almighty question, the state budget. And so what would be your priorities in balancing the state budget? And Mike, you get first response to your priorities in balancing the state budget.
Okay. There's very important priorities. I'll just start with state employees. We have a lot of state employees in our district, and last session they did not get a raise. Our state employees are very important. We have outstanding state employees. And so clearly they need to have a raise this upcoming biennium. Now, whether it be 2 and 2 or possibly even 3 and 3, one of the foundations of our state employees, they have really good benefits. And so we need to keep those in place as well. So that's one priority. Education funding, we've had quite a bit of discussion about that. We need to continue and not make any reductions in our education funding. Behavioral health, we've talked about that, and that would be a priority that if I were elected, that I would like to see the legislature address and is going to have to address. Another one is infrastructure, and we've talked about that. And whether that be provided through the legacy fund proposal or the proposal that Senator Wardner has set forth, where counties and cities would each get $115 million by reallocating the oil and gas production tax. That's an important priority. So those would be 4 that I think are very high on the list.
Great, thank you. Brandy, same question. What are your priorities in balancing the state budget?
I think going into it, making a promise that I'm going to be able to balance out the state budget on my own would be a falsehood to the residents of District 47. So one of the things I would do to work towards balancing out the budget would be to work with the senators there so that we can have discussions on what they've already seen as progressive moves or steps to take towards that effort of balancing it out. But to kind of go around to the state employees, I think that if our supermajority wouldn't have struggled with fiscal mismanagement the last biennium, our state employees wouldn't have been receiving pink slips instead of raises. And I think that when we're talking about how we're making promises and how we're going to support either any employee, whether they be state or private or independent sector, that we need to stop making promises and actually start including them in the conversations if we want to be impacting them in the way that we see fit on a state government level.
Okay, thank you for your response. Additional thoughts about this?
Well, the legislature had to cut $1.7 billion, and I don't think I could agree with Brandy that it was fiscal mismanagement, but clearly it was a downturn in the economy, not just oil, but agriculture and sales tax and all other sources. And so to be able to come out of that, it was a tough decision, I'm sure. Of course, I wasn't there either, but it was a tough decision to not give our state employees raises. But clearly they need to have that as one of the high priorities for this upcoming session.
Anything further?
I do agree that they should feel valued in their position.
Great, thank you. You bring up oil, and so let's talk a little bit about the energy sector and what future do you see the energy sector playing or having, and what kind of impact do you see energy having on us in the coming year? So Brandy, we'll lead to you.
Are you talking about energy as a whole, or oil, natural resources?
We can. Well, while we break it up, and let's talk about oil and fossil fuels.
Okay. I think that's going to be. I think oil in the oil industry is going to continue being a huge revenue source for the state of North Dakota. Just being honest in what it has done for our state and our families. one of the things that I hope to see is that we continue holding those companies accountable so that they can support North Dakota families and residents and communities in the way that are necessary and meet our needs. So whether that be maintaining some of the oil extraction rates that we have instead of continuing to lessen them might be a way of looking at it. I know that we continue to increase windmills and we're looking at other ways to continue maintaining the coal industry. And it's exciting when we're thinking about how we're implementing technology and looking at modern ways to have sustainable energy and jobs and expanding that. I just get excited about what future conversations we can start having with these employees in these industries that are going to continue taking North Dakota in the future.
Okay. Thank you. Mike, your thoughts about fossilized fuel, oil, gas?
So is the question, what role does it play, or what role should it play?
You can take it either direction.
Okay.
How's that?
Well, let's start with the oil extraction tax. The legislature reduced the oil extraction tax from 6.5% to 5%, but it was a good thing they did, because the triggers. I happened to be around in North Dakota in 1980 when the oil boom was happening, and all of a sudden it just disappeared. I mean, it was gone. And in this case, with the triggers, oil was going down, and with the triggers, the state would have lost about $1 billion. And so they made the decision to make the tax just clear and reduce it by 1.5%. So we have a 5% oil extraction tax and a 5% oil and gas production tax, which brought in an additional, if they hadn't taken that action, it would have been about $1 billion less in revenue. We're so fortunate in North Dakota to have both of those industries. Lignite, there was just an energy conference on Monday. They estimated North Dakota has enough lignite for 800 years into the future of providing electricity, and with electric cars and all the new innovations and opportunities. And then oil, they are doing such a much better job. The technology has even advanced in the last 5 years, and we're just fortunate to have both industries in North Dakota.
Great. So, any further discussion about the role of oil and gas and fossilized fuels?
My brother was the head of the North Dakota Lignite Council for 30 years, so I've heard all about coal.
Fair enough. Wonderful. So this will be our last question, and that is, what changes do you foresee to the state's budget section? And Mike, you'll have first response to that, to the state's budget section, and what changes do you foresee?
Okay, so the question is kind of in connection with the lawsuit that was filed and the dispute between the legislature and the governor and the Supreme Court.
Sure.
I believe said that the budget section was probably not constitutional, and so the legislature is going to have to make some changes. They've had a budget section of about 40 legislators. They make financial decisions in the interim. The Supreme Court said that's not something that the entire legislature has to make those decisions. So I'm not exactly sure how the legislature is going to respond, but they are going to have to respond in some manner. I don't really have any recommendations, because I just know that they're going to have to do something.
Okay, thank you. Brandy, your response?
My understanding is pretty similar to Mike's, actually, and I think that moving forward, hopefully whatever conclusions that they come to and steps they take for implementation moving forward are sound and don't get us back into this situation.
Wonderful. Thank you. So that leads us to the end of our questions, and it's the opportunity for our closing remarks. And since Mike, you had first opening remark, Brandy will have first closing remarks. And so, Brandy, please share with us your closing remarks.
Okay, thank you. Well, again, for the first time in 24 years, we the people of District 47 have an opportunity to revitalize the North Dakota legislature with a fresh perspective. As a veteran of the United States Army, through my services, I did come to realize that we're not red or blue in the work that we do, but we're actually Americans. And as a mother and a community member, I am familiar with the issues that our families are impacting, and I do understand the changing dynamics in our state. And I will find solutions and to be able to adapt to these changes that are taking place that take into consideration all of our needs. So that's why I ask you to vote with me on November 6th so that we can bring some dignity and respect back into the North Dakota legislature. Thank you.
Thank you. Mike, your closing remarks.
I will also provide that fresh perspective. I grew up on a farm ranch in western North Dakota. I love the heritage of being a North Dakotan. I believe in free enterprise, limited government, individual initiative, and balanced budgets. I learned a strong work ethic from my dad, an Irish farmer who started his day well before daylight. If you are willing to work hard and don't care who gets the credit, there's no end to what you can accomplish. As a legislative advocate for water, I have worked with our legislature and congressional delegations. I have worked with federal, state, and local governments. I have argued cases before the North Dakota Supreme Court. I have started and maintained successful businesses. I volunteered as a varsity basketball coach for 27 seasons. The principles of our basketball success were hard work, teamwork, excellence in everything we did, and character. Tell the truth, do the right thing, treat others like you'd like to be treated, and do your best. If I am elected, those principles will guide me as the state senator for District 47. I would appreciate your vote. Thank you.
Thank you. This concludes our debate, and our thanks to the candidates and the League of Women Voters and Dakota Media Access for organizing this event. This recorded program will air on Government Access Cable Channels 2 and 602 HD in the days leading up to the November 6th election. It will also be available for online viewing at www.freetv.org. Before we close, we'd like to remind you that you will need a form of identification to vote in North Dakota. You can find identification requirements and additional voting information on the websites or at the offices of your county auditor and the North Dakota Secretary of State. Thank you for joining us.